just so these are our objectives for today, is really to cover the basics of affordable housing development. In a lot of ways, it's not any different than developing market development, just slight tweaks. So if each of you on this call might have a different definition of affordable housing, or maybe you're not even developing affordable housing, you're just a community land trust and want to develop housing, you should be able to gain something from this. We're going to talk about the basics of the process, the stages that you go through to create a real estate development projects, talk about the team that you need to be successful and help identify kind of what your role is versus the others. And then we'll talk about a methodology of how you make a project financially viable, or get it to kind of pencil out and kind of work, from the beginning moments of conceiving of it. And it's first you need to know if it's viable, and if not, how do you answer that question? Is it viable or not? And if it's not viable, then how do you go about adjusting your project to make it more financially viable? And we'll share some examples throughout the different components that kind of demonstrate what we're talking about. So a bit more about Cahdco and CCOC. Cahdco is a nonprofit real estate development corporation. We're based in Ottawa. We've mostly focused on creating projects in Ottawa and Eastern Ontario, such as Kingston and some of the smaller towns. We effectively have the same role and responsibility as a for-profit developer, but we're focused on creating affordable housing, which sometimes has been rental housing and sometimes has been home ownership. But usually what's in common is we're working with not-for-profits and charities to help create that. Sometimes it's under our own banner. It's a Cahdco project, and that's typically affordable home ownership. It might be under the banner of our related corporation, Centertown Citizens Ottawa Corporation, or CCOC. They develop and operate mixed income affordable housing. And we also take all of those experiences and sell our services to other nonprofits, co-ops, and charities who want to create affordable housing, even some market developers. They can hire us to kind of help them enable their project. This is a number of the clients that we're working with or have worked with recently. Most of them are nonprofits and charities, but there, as I was saying, there is a few market developers as well, and all different types of housing and affordable housing, whether it's the ownership structure, such as that nonprofit charity versus co-op, or it might be the people who live there. Some of the groups we've worked with have created affordable housing for a particular demographic, such as seniors or youth. And sometimes people are creating affordable housing for a particular financial level of affordability, and sometimes it's mixed. Just like our related corporation, CCOC, they don't provide housing for a particular demographic, and they don't provide it at a particular level of affordability. They kind of mix and match throughout their building. And as I said, we're focused kind of on the Ottawa area. In addition to really helping groups with like the bricks and mortar and the money side of creating affordable housing projects, in the past year, we've been developing something that we call the Toolbox Plus. And really that is taking the knowledge that we have in the practice of creating affordable housing and trying to share that with other organizations who are looking to do that. So in part, this presentation is towards that, but we actually have a much more detailed program or series of programs that groups can sign up to. So if you like what you kind of hear today and you're interested in diving in deeper into developing affordable housing, then possibly these could be for you. The Blueprints program is a program for groups that are really at the early stages. These are typically organizations that don't have a lot of internal capacity, maybe have never developed affordable housing before or haven't done it in a long time. And they're looking to kind of learn the basics. And then the Foundations program is for groups that are already developing affordable housing, but they want to scale it up and kind of, rather than doing one project at a time, they're thinking about doing 3 or 4 or 5 projects at a time. So we have a program that's kind of built towards them, which is about like capacity development. And then finally, we kind of do all of this through a social network. And so in part, in signing up and being part of these programs, you kind of are part of a social network. Think of it like a Facebook group where everybody in that group is actively developing affordable housing, and you don't just have to go to a program. You can kind of learn from your peers. So if you're interested, find what we say today has some value, you want to know more, then feel free to follow up with us. So this is an example of a project that we are working on right now. It's almost finished. It'll be done in a few months. It started in 2020. And in the foreground is an Anglican church. This is in the Cahdco suburb of Ottawa. And they had a bigger site. They had a lot of faith groups who own property used to have a rectory or a manse, or a place where the minister used to live, and this location was no different. And there hasn't been a rector that's lived there for over 20 years, and they had actually rented it out to a community organization. And a couple of years ago, they decided they were going to tear that down and replace that, what was a single family home, with this 4-story mixed use apartment building. So it's like 3 stories of affordable an apartment building, affordable housing, and on the ground floor, there's commercial spaces for 2 community organizations, one that's providing services to seniors, and another that is like a community food center and provides food services to the neighborhood, like a food bank. And so in essence, this project was able to be created because you had a property owner who was really interested in creating affordable housing and kind of willing to make it happen. And they were able to navigate those risks and partnered with a couple other organizations to help kind of enhance the project and make it better. And in the end, they didn't buy the land. The project is effectively leasing it from the Anglican church. So I'm going to pass it over to Moj again, who's going to kind of go through the next steps. And just on the left here on this slide is kind of the topics that we're going to follow through on. Go ahead, Moj.
Thank you, Grant. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's dive into what affordable housing is. This is the CMHC housing continuum. It's a linear representation of different types of housing. It's somewhat representation of the tenuousness of tenure, but it's not a perfect model, as we will discuss on the next slide. On the left is the most tenuous, homelessness, where people do not have a place to live. And on the right is the market home ownership. The dashed blue box identifies the range of housing types we are talking about today: emergency shelters, transitional housing, social housing, affordable rental housing, and affordable home ownership. All of these are considered affordable housing. Emergency shelters and transitional housing often require additional supports for tenants. These are housing forms where households don't have a lease and are in an intermittent phase. Social housing is housing that is typically thought of as affordable rental housing that has an operational subsidy. It's a bit of dated term. Affordable rental housing is often what people think of when they say affordable housing. It's what CCOC does. And affordable homeownership is like Habitat for Humanity. Realistically, the housing continuum doesn't represent a linear path. Some people will move through the continuum, but others may change housing types in different ways. Some may still in housing with supports for the rest of their life. The CMHC wheelhouse model that we see on the screen in this slide demonstrates this with 3 major categories: safety net, housing with supports, and market housing. Any of these housing types may be what is referred to as mixed housing, when there are many different kinds of people living in the building. Any of these can also be for a specific group of people. This is more typically supportive housing. Who lives in affordable housing? Various people live in CCOC's model of mixed housing. Other projects may be geared to a specific group of tenants. Listed on a screen are some of the priority categories listed in the National Housing Strategy. These include women and children, seniors, indigenous people, homeless people, people living with disabilities, veterans, young adults, newcomers, and people living with mental health and addiction issues. All kinds of different people with different needs and different requirements for affordability. The general definition of affordable housing is spending no more than 30% of your gross household income on shelter. This is typically thought of as RGI or rent geared to income. We are moving away from this model now because it is generally difficult to administer as people earn all different amounts. As a disclaimer, this is not a complete list. There are some of terms used to describe the level of affordability. Municipalities and service managers define affordability for their funding programs based on average market rent or AMR for an area. This looks at all of the rental rates for all apartments in that area, including new builds and older buildings. To come up with an affordable rent, we often hear below market rent or BMR, which is often 80% of that AMR number, but sometimes it's 70%. We use this to set subsidized rental rates for the affordable units. CMHC programs relate to median market rate or MMR, which is similar to AMR, but a different way of measuring it. That level is still not affordable to some tenants. People on Ontario Work or Ontario Disability cannot afford 70% of AMR. So for supportive housing or often mixed within a mixed housing model, there are some units set as the shelter rate of OW or ODSP. This is typically the deepest level of affordability that we see in affordable housing project. On this slide, you can see the different rent levels for a one-bedroom apartment in City of Ottawa. Our next project example is MHI Veterans House. This project is targeted toward supportive housing for veterans. There are 40 units in total, all of which have rents at the ODSP rent level. Veterans House opened in 2021. There is an emphasis on communal spaces to meet the needs of the military culture, and the outdoor spaces are composed of quiet sitting areas as well as a space to accommodate the needs of tenants with service dogs. Here are some renderings and photos of the project. The client MHI or Multi-Faith Housing Initiative hadn't thought about doing affordable housing for veterans. However, there was a large need in Ottawa, so they responded from a needs perspective. Okay, needs assessment. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this section is based on the needs assessment resources included in the Rural Development Networks, a step-by-step guide to developing affordable housing. What is needs assessment? The purpose of the needs assessment is to prepare a report that identifies the need in a designated community. It provides an overview of various important metrics to help the housing developer to identify or confirm the need in their community and serve as evidence that the need actually exists. A need assessment can help to inform the development of a project concept, inform type of affordable housing, the target demographics or tenant groups or rent levels. Also, it can confirm if the type of project your organization is proposing meets a need in the community, which will then be very helpful for funding applications. After doing a needs assessment, you may need to reassess your project concept if the evidence shows a different need than the project was initially addressing. Keep in mind that a single project is likely not going to be able to address all the needs that exist in the community. A key component of undertaking a needs assessment is gathering relevant quantitative and qualitative data for the community you are working in. Data is critical to confirming the anecdotal evidence gathered by community members. Funding bodies and governments particularly will want to see research and data to back the need for affordable housing. While anecdotal evidence can be helpful to start the process of exploring the need for housing, sometimes once the data is examined, it can actually tell a very different story than what the anecdotal evidence suggests. You don't have to collect data yourself and don't reinvent the wheel. There are many sources that exist already that you can use. For example, you can contact the local municipality where your proposed project is located to see if a needs assessment already exists. Also, you can explore other sources, including Statistics Canada, where you can find information on population, income, housing costs, and etc. And CMHC, which deals more with 10-year rent vacancy, or provincial or regional health authorities for population projections, or waiting lists for social housing, and other local sources like a municipal strategic plan and land use plans. A first step in needs assessment is understanding the local community in which your project is located. You need to know about the study area location and context, proximity to a major center, goods and services, the history of the area, the largest industries in the local area. And the second thing you want to know about is any community trends, economic events and news that would affect the local economy of the local area. Efforts to develop or advance the housing system in the local area. This can include existing developments or past achievements as well as future initiatives. And population growth trends near 50 years relative to region or the province. And the third thing is the key demographic information to understand the background and context surrounding the community to support the development of the business case, like the makeup of the population, household types, household incomes, and migration patterns and education. Next, we want to understand the existing housing supply in the local community in which your project is located. Here is an example of the breakdown of existing housing building types within a community, which might give a sense of where supply is high and where it might be lacking. Housing supply analysis describes various metrics such as community's diversity of unit types and rental market statistics to provide detailed information regarding the housing situation in the area. It might look at things like 10-year ownership versus rental, building types, unit types, rents, vacancy rates, what is income threshold for affordability, and what are the conditions of the existing housing stock. After understanding the supply, we want to analyze the housing demand in the local community in which your project is located, which provides a glance into pinpointing where the need is. A housing demand analysis looks at statistics for a few variables. The first one is adequacy. Is the state of housing adequate in terms of age, upkeep with major repairs? The second is suitability. Is the housing suitable to meet the demand in terms of housing diversity, number of bedrooms, and accessibility? The third one is affordability. Are the average monthly housing costs such that people are overpaying for shelter, and if so, what are the proportions? And the fourth one, counts and estimates, homeless counts, shelter occupancy rates, Cornish estimation, for example, how many homes are required to address the need. Once we understand the housing supply and the housing demand, we can move on to the gap analysis. A gap analysis quantifies the need in the community for a range of different housing types. It is what brings it all together, the needs analysis, if you will. It looks at the existing housing inventory in the community, and it determines the difference, the need, also known as demand, and what already exists, also known as supply. You can look at gaps from various perspectives, including by types of housing, bedrooms, supportive, etc., and or by demographics, seniors, families, or etc. So this summarizes the component of needs assessment. Quantitative and qualitative data is used in each phase of analysis, bringing together data from various sources to understand where the gaps are. To recap, the needs assessment will come in handy in defining, confirming, refining your project concept to ensure it is meeting a need in the community, and it will help to build business case to seek board approval, funding, lending, fundraising, etc. And also it will help to meet document requirements for funding and lending processes. As we noted previously, it is unlikely that a single project will be able to address all of the need that is existing in the community. For example, if a needs assessment shows need among families, singles, and seniors, a specific need for each group might be different in terms of type of housing. Once need is identified, focus on a specific need that you want to address, and the one that aligns with your organization's mandate and mission, and the one that most prevalent or relevant to you, and the one for which funding is available. Next, I will be talking about 3 types of projects an organization can undertake. The 3 types are retrofit, renovation, acquisition, and new development. Retrofitting existing buildings, including restoring deteriorating existing housing stock, is a great way to transform underutilized assets. However, retrofit projects come with a unique set of challenges and have varying levels of difficulty due to building condition, material value, and zoning complications. Some might perceive retrofit or rehab as a lower cost method of development, but that is not always the case. Next is acquisition. Acquiring existing buildings in relatively good physical condition can make affordable housing units available to households much faster and in a wider set of locations. Acquisition is also a means of preserving existing affordable housing stock, ensuring that it is not lost to private market. Finally, there is new development. This method offers the most creative freedom and design choice as you are not constrained by an existing building footprint. Most of the funding programs for affordable housing development in Canada prioritize new construction over acquisition and rehab. Other advantages include a more energy efficient and accessible building, as well as newer building materials. Before jumping into details about the project team and development process, I wanted to first touch on the key basic components required to make a project possible. Any development project, affordable housing or not, needs three basic components. First is money, that's capital, and then you need land, which is where you are going to build the project or vacant building if you are doing an acquisition. And you need capacity, so who is going to be able to see the project through on both the project team side and the client or housing provider side. We think of this as a three-legged stool. If you are missing any one of these three components, your project is not going to stand up and you won't be able to move forward. These three components are really key to the success of a project. It's a complex process to get through a development project, so your development team and the people that you bring on board are really key to success. And this slide outlines key groups that are essential to the success of a project, including landowner, housing provider, project team, operator, community partners, support service providers, funders, and regulators. Regulators, which can be municipality, service manager, CMHC, and they are important allies for every project. This is one of several ways to structure your team. The way we see it, there are 4 key members of a project team. The client or housing provider is the owner and or operator of the site. They will be bringing the land and money. The project manager is the coordinator and brings the capacity that the housing providers does not have. That is what Cahdco does. We represent the owner or the client. The key consultants are the architect and the construction manager. You will see in this diagram the contractual relationship between all consultants and the client. The architect is the prime consultant. They involve other sub-consultants like engineers and other designers to help them in the design. And the construction manager coordinates all the various trades and suppliers both on and off-site. The CM or construction manager also reports the construction costs to the architects who certifies the construction work done. We, as the project manager, help the client figure out how the client is going to pay for these monthly bills during construction, either through their equity, grants, or financing, which Graham will talk about it later. The next project's example is Cornerstone Princeton. This project was the renovation of an existing convent into supportive housing for women. The project features 42 studios and 6 surface parking spots. The project was funded by multiple sources, including a municipal grant called Action Ottawa, waived city fees, and fundraising done by Cornerstone, which was the client. In this project example, Cornerstone is the landowner, housing provider, property manager, and support service provider. They work with other community partners to deliver services to tenants as well. Cornerstone also provided equity, as I just mentioned, to the project through fundraising. Cahdco led the core project team as a project manager. In this case, the regulators were CMHC and the City of Ottawa. Cornerstone Princeton was the result of a unique relationship between multiple partners. The Catholic sisters that previously owned the Princeton site were going to sell to a private developer who wanted the land around the property. They agreed to sell for $1 million below market value and for the developer to sever the property and to pass on the discount to Cornerstone. This is a good example of partnership between not-for-profits and profit organizations that are equally invested. Both parties benefited and both parties were required for the transaction to take place. So now we understand the need for affordable housing. Let's dive into how we create it. We think of development in these four distinct phases. We are displaying this process as a bit of a timeline. You will see that there is a lot of variability in the phases. Some groups will take years to get through the design and feasibility stage. Often this has to do with missing one of the 3 legs of the stool and having to figure out how to get all 3 of legs and make the project stand up. Design development is when you know you have the 3 legs in place. This is when you bring on many of the other consultants and design the details of the project. Construction typically takes a year and a half or longer. The first stage, operations, is when the building is up and running and the nonprofit then operates the building. Cahdco is involved and often leading the first 3 phases, but the housing provider takes on the 4th stage. So the first phase is design analysis and feasibility. This is when you flesh out what your project is going to be. You start this phase when a project is conceived and different groups get to this moment in different ways. Some groups may have a specific population and they really want to serve. Other groups have land but don't know what they want to do with it. And some may have money and not know what to do with that. Once you have this idea, it's figuring out how to pull all the other pieces together. In this phase, you will identify and select your site if you don't already have it, and you will often get site investigation studies done to know what you're working with, or a site assessment to see if there is a contamination in the ground. If it's adaptive reuse, you will do a building condition assessment or BCA. You will usually bring an architect on board or someone to do early design concept work. During this phase, you will look at the city planning regulations and zoning to know what you can actually build. You will create your initial pro forma or financial model, and that's really understanding whether you can make the project work financially and figuring out where the money will come from to build your project. It's only when you are able to answer all of these questions that you will go to your board if you are a nonprofit and get approval for that stage and move on from feasibility, knowing that you have a project that can go ahead. This project example is YSB Youth Hub. For some context, YSB Youth Hub is for youth ages 16 to 24. The building provides 39 apartments to formerly homeless youth integrated with support services. YSB operates other programs on the ground floor. This slide shows an example of an early concept design for the YSB Youth Hub, which completed construction in 2019. You can see that there is an idea of where the building will be developed, but it's part of the early concept designs and not yet detailed. This is the level of detail often used when applying for funding.
So we'll jump into how to make your project financially viable. Again, we're assuming groups are coming from all over the country, and you might be creating slightly different types of housing, whether it's demographic or affordability. Maybe some are doing ownership, maybe some are doing rental. So we're trying to make this relevant to everybody. And a lot of this is the same if it's market development versus what we kind of define as affordable housing. The principles are all the same. So including this analogy of a juggling act. So really financial viability is dependent on balancing these three factors. If you're a land trust or you're a not-for-profit, you're really creating your project for what we call like a missional goal. That might be to create a certain amount of affordable housing, or social services at a certain level of affordability, maybe for a particular demographic. And you're only going to do the project if you achieve that. You're not just going to create any project for any purpose. If you happen to be a market developer, your mission would be profit. So, you're going to create a project that, ideally makes a profit, and you might be flexible on the type of project or the demographic, for instance. But as well, if you're creating affordable housing, you're going to need some type of government support. The basic financial formula for creating affordable housing is the more government or non-government grants and financial support that you get, the less mortgage financing you need, the more affordable the project can be. So, there is a heavy importance on kind of getting that government support, and there is a limited amount of government money out there. It doesn't matter what province you're in. So it's not just about meeting the basic requirements of whatever government program, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal you're applying to, but consider that you're actually competing against everybody else on this call for a limited amount of money. And so not only do you have to meet the minimum requirements, you need to present a project that the government will choose above and beyond other projects. And so that, maybe is a better way of thinking about it rather than meeting the minimum government requirements is how do you kind of maximize that, think about return on investment. And so that might be level of affordability, but that could also include things like energy efficiency requirements, accessibility, and sometimes government programs target particular affordable housing levels or demographics. And then in addition to the housing side of it, you also need to consider the government requirements such as the planning and the zoning. And then finally, there's the site and the market conditions. Land has a value. If you're going to build a building, you have to pay somebody to do it, and they have to buy the materials to build it, and it all has to be done to a minimum level of quality. And so all of that has a cost. You can't build something for less than basically what everybody else is building it for. And so when you're thinking about your project, yes, you want to achieve your mission, but to achieve the mission, you need to get the government support. You need to compete against everybody else for that. And at the same time, you can't ignore what the market conditions are. You can't just build a really expensive building if you're not able to afford to build it. So determining viability of a project is really a continuous process. It begins at the really earliest possible moment when you start to think about it. You'll hear people use this term back of the napkin. They're not really writing on napkins, but in essence, developers, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, who have lots of experience, can look at a site and quickly understand, even using just in their head without writing it down, what might be able to be built there and whether it might be financially viable based on the previous projects that they've worked on. But for the most part, you have to go through a basic process to understand financial viability. And where we begin is we typically are working on a project for ourselves or a client, and we engage them to find out what their objectives are, and whether that's developing a building of a certain size, certain level of affordability for a particular target demographic, a certain unit mix. Do they want any other services in there? And then you look at the site that they own, or if they're looking for a site, then you might be looking at different sites and understand what the city or municipal rules are as to what you can build there. And so kind of with that basic understanding of what the group wants to build and what is allowed on the site, you can create a rough massing. I think of this like a Lego block on the property as to like the size and scale of what you can build there, which helps you understand the height, the dimensions, the amount of units, maybe if there's any other uses in the building. And once you're comfortable with that basic concept design, you can apply some very high level assumptions to create your initial preliminary pro forma model. And that would be assumptions around things like per square foot construction costs, the amount of parking spaces that you might want, what's your level of risk, how much contingency do you want to have in the project at the early stages. If you're a not-for-profit or a charity, do you get certain tax rebates like HST or property taxes? And kind of using those high-level assumptions, you can begin to estimate the capital cost of the project or the cost to build the building itself. If you're doing home ownership, you might kind of stop there. If you're doing rental housing, you're going to then look at creating an operating budget for once the building is built. What would be the annual cost to operate the building? And where possible, if you own other buildings, you might use those existing buildings to kind of estimate and anticipate the cost to operate the new building. And if not, you might hire consultants or get data to help you with that. And with the understanding of the cost to build the development and to operate the building, you start to identify the potential sources of funding and financing. How are you going to pay for the cost to build the building? And then once it's built, will you have enough revenues from rent and otherwise to pay for the operating expenses? Anecdotally, you do this, and at the end, once you've identified the costs to operate and build, and then the sources, you've basically created your initial project budgets, or what people call in the development sector the pro forma, just the slang for budgets. And for it to be financially viable, if you're a not-for-profit, typically what you're thinking is, do our sources or revenues equal our expenses? That's a basic principle. But anecdotally, they won't the first time. It's very difficult to do real estate development. If it was easy, we would all do it. We'd all be very wealthy, successful developers. It's very difficult as well to develop affordable housing. And if it was easy, we wouldn't have such a crisis in Canada with housing affordability. And so what I want to just say is, the first time you create your pro forma, some of you might already be there, some that's coming up, and you identify the costs and look at the sources, your sources are most likely going to be less than your costs. You're going to think, oh, this project doesn't make financial sense. And you're right. But I encourage you not to give up at that moment, because my advice to you is everybody is in that same position at that moment. Again, if it was so easy, we would be doing a lot more housing. It's not. And so at that point, what you look to do is you look to refine the criteria. Maybe if you're creating an apartment building and it had a whole bunch of 3-bedroom apartments, you might take 2 3-bedroom apartments and turn them in, take 1 3-bedroom apartment and turn it into 2 1-bedroom apartments. And that might actually improve the financial viability of the project, just as an example. But you kind of look back and adjust the criteria. That will change the concept. The concept changes the assumptions. And you then follow that through to kind of update and go around in a second iteration. If your sources or revenues are getting closer to your expenses, you're heading in the right direction. Keep changing and iterating with those same things in mind. If they're heading further apart, maybe there's been inflation, maybe the interest rates went up, then you're heading in the wrong direction, and think about how you might change different assumptions to improve the financial viability. So that seems like a simple graphic, but really that is the black box of development. And I'm going to go through that on a step-by-step, and we'll come back to this image in about 5 or 6 slides and kind of re-emphasize how we go through this. So again, typically we'll start with the capital budget. So this is all about creating the pro forma, which is typically an Excel document with a series of interlinked budgets, operating, capital, maybe some other assumptions. And the main goal is for the sources to equal the costs. So typical upfront capital costs include land, soft costs, and hard costs. Again, affordable housing, market housing, this is all the same. Typical examples of categories of sources will include government grants. It could be government, it could be NGO, like foundations or otherwise, mortgage financing, possibly money from partners who are involved in the project, doing it together, and then your own equity. And again, in our experience, every project that we've worked on has essentially needed money from all of these sources. And sometimes you need multiple sources from these categories. I'm going to break down this in a bit more in the next slide, but for just to recognize, maybe it's the elephant in the room, all the projects that we work on are creating affordable housing. It's with nonprofits and charities, and nonprofits and charities are not sitting on a lot of money or equity to create affordable housing. So that is usually one of the big hangups in a project, is how do groups kind of mobilize equity, and we'll kind of talk about that. So here are some general sources. How we think about this is the more money you can get from other sources, the better. You're going to have limited equity, so you kind of want to maximize the first 3 sources before you think about how much equity you're going to need to contribute. We usually start left to right, and the more money that you can get from other sources that is a grant that you do not have to pay back, as long as you meet the terms of the contract, the better, the greater level of affordability you'll be able to create. So you're going to look at all different levels of government, and at the federal level, that might be CMHC. So we're all going to think about CMHC, but if you're in a different city or province, you'll have unique programs to your province and or your city. Some examples from municipalities might be land. Sometimes municipalities will have land that they provide to groups that create affordable housing. Sometimes municipalities might waive property taxes or development charges. In Toronto, there's a program called Open Doors Toronto, or maybe it's a capital grant. And one of our examples, Mojigan had mentioned that in Ottawa, that's called Action Ottawa. And again, in some provinces, that's at a municipal level, and in some provinces, that's at a provincial level. After you've maximized the amount of money you think you can get from other sources that are grants that you don't have to pay back, as long as you meet the expectations of when you're receiving the money, then you look to maximize the financing. So that's somebody else's money, but you have to pay it back and pay it back with interest. A big part of the CMHC National Housing Strategy is mortgage loans, not grants. They're for long amortized periods, and they provide below market interest rates, but you still do have to pay it back. So it's not it does kind of create a financial hurdle. Other groups might get financing from conventional banks instead of CMHC, or they might even get financing from secondary sources, sometimes called social financing or green bonds. Next, are there any opportunities for partnerships? If you're creating like one of our projects, it was a mixed use project, affordable housing above these commercial units that were occupied by community organizations providing social services. In that project, one group paid for all the project costs of the whole building, but then leased the ground floor, and that the revenues from the lease of the ground floor helped them pay for the cost of the project by getting mortgage financing. So, they kind of leveraged the partnership value through a lease, but sometimes that partnership could be more like a joint venture, like a condo, and the commercial partner can pay for their piece and the housing partner pays for theirs. And then finally, and specifically last, will be your own equity. Every one of us has limited equity. You want to put in as little as possible. But in our experience, even if you exhaust all of these other sources and you have the greatest project ever and nobody's ever done it before, you're going to create, something that is unique. All of those sources will not add up to all the expenses, and you're going to have to contribute some equity. And it might come from maybe you already own the land and you're contributing that. That has a market value to it. It could be savings if you already own other properties and you've done a good job of, getting more rents than expenses. Or maybe if you're a charity, it's fundraising. Maybe you're leveraging, like maybe if you have another property that doesn't have a mortgage, you leverage that asset to contribute to this. But just to suffice it to say, how we tend to coach our clients is think about all these categories as necessary, and you want to maximize the amount of money you get in all of these categories from as many sources as possible, rather than look at the idea of how do we not contribute any equity and just get money from other sources, because in that case it's going to be a very uphill battle. It's hard to do it as it is. So you're most likely to have success if you can kind of think about maximizing all of these categories rather than maximizing some and minimizing others. Sorry for the acronyms, but some common sources of funding that people look at for affordable housing are 3 different organizations that we've outlined across the top here. And across the side, we've kind of outlined what programs you might want to apply to depending on the stage of the project you're at. So we'll provide the presentation and you can look at the discount or look at the details. The Canadian Housing Transformation Center, that is an organization that got created during the National Housing Strategy to help groups with the capacity to develop and operate affordable housing. So they have small grants at the early stages to help you with the capacity. That capacity might be hiring a group like Cahdco or another group in your area like us. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities is not the government, but a non-government organization that has a program to help groups with grants and loans to develop affordable housing. But you need to be creating a project that is very energy efficient. You'll probably want to do that anyway, because everybody wants to create energy efficient, sustainable housing. And they have a series of programs that you can apply to as you go through your project. And then there's Canadian CMHC, Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and they have different sources that you basically apply to later. There's the seed program at the beginning, and then you might apply to the co-investment fund or one of the other CMHC programs. And then your municipality or province also might have programs. It really varies by province and sometimes by municipality. In Ontario, it's by municipality. Most other places, it's by province.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Oh, it looks like you're about to do it. I just wanted to get your take on CMHC, because we've heard from other people that it's very difficult to use their funding. So it looks like you're about to talk about that.
Yeah, it is difficult. And in some ways, I think everybody wishes it was easier, but also to say that CMHC has a limited amount of money. And so in some ways, their difficult process weeds out those who are able to overcome the challenges and those that aren't. If they had a less difficult process, then there'll be more groups still trying to get the same amount of money. So if you are able to overcome the challenges, it's like, for the most part, every affordable housing project that's being created these days does involve some CMHC program or another. And the complexity of their programs is kind of the bar that you have to eclipse to have success. So it's hard, but development is hard. So these are the one thing I'll say about CMHC. I'm not going to go through the details of what's on the screen. You'll get the slides, but at a high level, CMHC has about a dozen programs, and about half of those programs are for groups like yourselves who want to create affordable housing, and it's a combination of grants and mortgage financing. Half of the programs are for organizations that have big ideas that can be scaled up and can really help solve and tackle the housing and homelessness problems that we have across the country. It is not meant to pay for costs attributed to a physical building project. So it's, and some of those names are like this, we haven't put them on the screen because we don't want you to focus on them, but it's like the Innovation Fund, the Solutions Lab, the Housing Supply Challenge. These programs are amazing, but they are not to help pay for costs for building a building. If you're looking to build a building, focus on the right programs, and that includes the seed funding program, small grants to do early feasibility work, and that includes typical programs like the co-investment, the rental construction financing initiative, the rapid housing initiative, and there are a couple others. But don't get distracted by the other ones that sound amazing, but they're really research and development. And when you're applying to CMHC, it's important to know that all of these programs have a different affordability requirement. So depending on the level of affordability you're looking to create in your project, you might apply to one program or another. If it's deeply affordable, you'll apply to the Rapid Housing Initiative. If it's modestly affordable, you might apply to the co-investment. If you're a market developer who just wants to have a few affordable housing units in your building, you might apply to the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. Each of these programs also has energy efficiency and accessibility requirements. And again, you're competing for limited money with many groups. And so to have success at CMHC, not only do you have to overcome the challenges of how to apply to the program, but you have to, be a better project than the other groups according to these three requirements. So now that we've kind of talked about the capital costs and where the sources might come from, we'll jump over to the operating budget. This is relevant for groups creating rental housing, not as much about home ownership. This is when you start to think about the rent revenues and other sources that you might get to operate the building, such as parking or laundry if you have a common laundry room. In affordable housing, it's also sometimes there might be rent supplements, which is a little bit of a dated concept, and the more modern concept is called Canadian housing benefits, but it's basically for people who are of low income. It's supplemental revenue to help pay more for rent. As a landlord, you're getting more rent, but the person has a higher level of affordability. So you have all these revenues, you have typical operating expenses, a building costs what it costs to operate. So it's, maintaining it. Some groups pay property taxes, others get waivers, utilities, insurance. The difference between the revenues and the expenses is what you might think of as surplus. The market developer will think of as the profit. The bank will think of as the net operating income. It's the money that you have to pay for mortgage financing. So the greater your NOI, the more mortgage financing you can get. The more mortgage financing you can get, the less equity you need to contribute, which is, one of the limiting factors. But if you kind of start on the right and work backwards rather than the left and go right, if you think of this like a page on a book, if you're trying to minimize your equity and you want to increase your mortgage financing, then you're going to need a higher net operating income. And your expenses are pretty much fixed. And so what that means is you're going to need greater rent revenue. And really, when we're working with groups, the rent revenue, what your tenants are paying, is a representation of your mission. If you want to provide affordable housing, you want people to have lower rents. So the two things that people are thinking about typically when they're creating affordable housing and they're trying to make a project financially viable, and it's a balance between these two, they're related, is the groups are looking to minimize the amount of equity that they contribute, because we're all typically not-for-profits and charities and don't have a lot of money, or co-ops. And they're looking to achieve a certain level of affordability, which is represented in the rents that tenants pay. So again, the two get related between the debt financing. So we can't just sell the units for more and charge more rent to basically make the project financially viable. That might be the solution on the market side, but it's not to maintain affordability, and that's the whole purpose. So a lot of groups will start to think about how can we reduce costs. And I always encourage groups to kind of think of this as 4 categories. Like again, if you think about that, the process diagram that we started with, when your sources don't equal your expenses, we call this typically a gap, and you need to close the gap. What we encourage groups to do is to generate as many ideas that fit into 4 categories. Those are, how do you increase the capital sources, the grants, the loans, the equity? How do you decrease any capital expenses? Can you get the land at a below market price? Do you get any particular rebates based on your corporate status? Will the city waive any fees? So those are 2 categories. And then on the operating budget, can you increase your rent revenues or get rent supplements, or can you decrease your operating expenses? So when the project doesn't pencil out, you think in all of those categories, but often we're limited on the sources side and we focus on the cost side. So here's some examples of ways to decrease capital expenses and kind of fuses into operating expenses. And then you come back. You continue to refine. Every time we kind of conceptually go around this circle and update our concept of our project, update our assumptions, we update our Excel document, which is the pro forma, and we'll change the file name of the Excel file each time, just put a date at the end and update it every time. And at the end of a project, we'll have 100 versions of this. And in that first design analysis and feasibility phase, we might have more than 75. So, to make a project financially viable, whether it's market housing or affordable housing, it's really an optimization of assumptions in a table, in a budget, that typically almost everybody, even market developers, just use Excel. It's not as much about design and construction and all those things kind of relate to it, but really your project never happens if you can't get that initial budget to pencil out, even with those high level of assumptions. But nobody's does at the beginning. You always have to follow that process of create your initial concept, throw in the assumptions, adjust the concept, update the assumptions, see if you are getting closer to reducing that gap, and if you are, continue to do that. So one more example is we've tried in the examples to share examples of different types of affordable housing, both demographics and affordability, but also different project types, like Mojigan was talking about at the beginning: acquisition, retrofit, new development. So this is an example of a project that is for affordable rental housing for seniors. It's of a mixed income, and the organization, the King's Daughters and Sons, or KDS, they had owned, you'll see it kind of looks like 2 buildings, and it is. On the left, there's a white brick veneer building. It was built over 50 years ago. It was the first affordable seniors housing building in Ottawa. They had gotten government funding from CMHC originally when they built it. They had paid off the mortgage. Their agreement with the government had ended, so they kind of owned this building and were operating it free and clear. And they had a property that allowed them to expand, and they basically doubled the size of the building and built this addition, got the floors to line up. There was only 1 elevator in the original building. There's 1 in the addition. So now there's 2 elevators that serve each floor. There's a lot more amenity spaces to provide programs and services for the tenants, and both the tenants in the original building and the new building all benefit from that. So there's a benefit for everybody. But financially, it worked out well, as well because they had paid off their mortgage of that original building. So when they went to CMHC, they got mortgage financing through something called the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. When they went to CMHC and CMHC looked at their operating budget, the revenues were coming from all of the units in both the original building and in the new building that they were going to build. And so they had a greater NOI, which allowed them to get more mortgage financing and not contribute as much equity to the project and make it viable. So that's kind of a glimpse into what it takes to really make these projects viable. You can kind of see concept of the images there and some of the interior shots. In that top left image, it looks like there's painting sitting on the floor, and that's because it was taken before anybody moved in. They're mounted on the wall right now. So overall, you know, what you should really take away from this project is to create affordable housing. Every project needs the three legs of the stool. They need the money, the land, and then the capacity. We've worked on projects where groups haven't had any of those when they started and successfully created a project. And we've worked on projects where the groups seem to have all of those at the beginning and didn't have success. So having none or having all does not predicate success. You still have to, it's still a very difficult process, and you have to kind of be able as an organization to make decisions and work together, even when you have some land and some experience. Every project financially will need grants, mortgage financing, and equity. And to receive financing, you need that viable operating budget. If your project isn't financially viable at the beginning, it doesn't pencil out, you know, you want to think of all ideas that might improve it, but I really encourage you to focus on the operating budget because that's what will make a much bigger impact on the overall viability because of the mortgage financing. And really, you know, this is us, you know, in some ways tooting our own horn. Capacity is the key to this. Like if you don't have capacity and you can't work well together, then you're never going to overcome the other challenges. So, you know, if you're starting from scratch, really start with the foundations of have a good team, work well together, you know, within your organization. And then from there, by having a good team and working well together, you will be able to, you know, unlock the land and the money.